Welcome to Virtual Book Signing. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as usual, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. It's a beautiful day, so not too many came in, but I'm glad you're watching on the web, and we thank you for that. Remember that while we're live for the next hour, we invite you to email in questions to our authors today, and we'll immediately respond to them if we can, unless we're deluged. We can't get to them all. It's happened. But we hope we will be able to. So that's why you're virtually with us here. You can email in questions. So do that. If you'd like a copy or 7 of each of these books, let us know and we can get them signed for you. Excuse me. And of course, if you're watching now on the archive, please feel free to call in if you like a book. We probably will have first edition signed. As long as they're available, we do keep extra copies for you. And if you have not yet received our emails about our virtual book signings, I hope that you will think about getting us your email and you'll get notice from us. If you ever feel spammed, you can always get off. We'll take you off, but we think you'll enjoy it. Well, today we have three interesting books and 2 interesting authors. First of all, Arthur Downey, who is taught at Georgetown University Law Center and has been a lecturer at the Smithsonian on Civil War legal issues on Abraham Lincoln, and also American University's Civil War Institute. Today, his book, Civil War Lawyers, Constitutional Questions, Courtroom Dramas, and the Men Behind Them. American Bar Association Publishing is 461 pages and illustrated, and is $34.95. An interesting book. Well, all of our books are interesting, actually. We don't have uninteresting books here. As well, a reprise from Downey and Dirck, a professor of history at Anderson University, the author of Lincoln and Davis, Imagining America 1809 to 65, and the editor of Lincoln Emancipated, which many of you probably have, The President and Politics of Race. Today, actually, there are 2 books. I guess I should put the other one up too, huh? Abraham Lincoln and White America, University of Kansas Press, 213 pages, and is $29.95. And also, Lincoln and the Constitution, from Southern Illinois University Press. This is part of their concise Lincoln Library series. It's 169 pages, and like all of them is $19.95. I'm going to just open this up for a moment and tell you some of the others, because this is a series I think you should have on your shelf, and you can have probably every one of them signed first editions from us. Michael Burlingame was here with his Lincoln in the Civil War. Michael Green, Lincoln in the Election of 1860. Lincoln and Race by Richard Striner. Ken Winkle wrote Abraham and Mary Lincoln. He was here. And there are others in this series. And I think this is an important series, concise. The only thing I don't like about it is that there's not a good footnoting. I wish you'd put it onto the web. That's what Southern University should do. Illinois University, I'm asking them to do that right now. All right. So those are the 3 books that we're going to be discussing today. As usual, I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about your book. Art, why don't we begin with yours? Lincoln and, well, really the lawyers of the era. It's not just about Lincoln. It's really about all the lawyers and the issues, the legal issues, constitutional issues. You say prominent politicians were prominently lawyers, as you write in there. Well, if that's the case, were lawyers responsible for the Civil War? Since they were the ones in charge of government and everything else, it seemed. If they were all barbers in Congress, we probably could have cut a deal. But nonetheless,
shameless.
Still, we had so many lawyers.
Yeah.
Tell us about the book and why lawyers were responsible for the war.
First of all, it's not the fault of the lawyers. De Tocqueville said in the mid-1830s that he was kind of astonished by how lawyers ran the United States, how they were the band of brothers. They all read Blackstone and Kent, and they all studied the same, their analytical methods were the same. That didn't mean they all reached the same conclusions, quite to the contrary. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for asking about the book. As the subtitle says, I try to deal with a pitch to the average educated layman. This is not a book for lawyers, it's not a book for Civil War buffs, it's more general audience. And I deal with constitutional questions, with courtroom dramas, and the lawyers. Constitutional questions, the big ones, like was the Constitution pro-slavery? Surely it was. And the fact that it didn't change since 1804, but the United States changed fundamentally during that time, led to the Civil War. You have questions, constitutional questions of secession, which we still have today in a larger sense. The International Court of Justice just decided a case last year on the secession of Kosovo from Serbia. So these things are still out there. There were only 2 Supreme Court cases during the period that are relevant: Dred Scott and the prize cases during the war itself. But I also deal with how presidents and others dealt with constitutional issues that affected their decision-making. What did Lincoln do when confronted with the secession, basically, of West Virginia from Virginia, when his Attorney General says, this is unconstitutional and it's inexpedient? You really can't do this. And he did. And then courtroom dramas. We have the great dramatic courtroom scene of the John Brown trial. Herman Melville said the John Brown raid and the trial in 1859 was the meteor that ignited the Civil War. You have the wonderful trials in New York and Philadelphia of Southern privateers being tried for piracy that almost caused Great Britain to side with the South. Very interesting dramas. And of course, after the war, revenge trials, I call them, the Lincoln conspirators. And finally, the men behind them. No women at the time. Women were not admitted to the bar at that time. But the men behind them are extraordinary. As you said, Dan, at that time, the first 100 years of our country, the overwhelming majority of presidents were lawyers. Today, in the last 100 years, the majority of presidents were non-lawyers. Same thing in Congress. In the term that Lincoln was in the Congress, lawyers comprised 76% of the members of Congress. Today, in the current Congress, law is the 3rd profession. The first one being business, the second one being this odd thing of politics and public service, and lawyers are 3rd. So there's been a fundamental shift. People say we have too many lawyers today, but we really had too many lawyers maybe then. And so you have some of these characters who come in and out. They all knew each other. They tried cases together. You've treated before the famous Weeper case in Cincinnati in 1855, where you had Stanton being brutal to this young lawyer from Springfield. Wouldn't talk to him, wouldn't walk to the courtroom with him. Awful. And yet, Lincoln appoints him. You have people like Reverdy Johnson, who is this fellow here, who was an extraordinary character. After Webster died, Daniel Webster died in 1852, Reverdy Johnson became the most prominent lawyer in America. Little known today, but he was U.S. Attorney General, twice United States Senator, U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain, an extraordinary character who saved Lincoln early on when Maryland was so fraught. Anyway, so the book deals with each of those 3 broad issues: constitutional issues, courtroom dramas where lives were at stake, and these men who were all over the place and knew each other.
Just very quickly, why this book in your life at this time?
My first book was on Abraham Lincoln, the Vampire Killer. But then I decided that just wouldn't sell. Hollywood would never buy the movie
Bad
rights.
business decision there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I decided to scuttle that effort, and so I just turned to this.
Okay, that sounds good enough to me.
No, to be serious, there have been fabulous books on specific legal issues, or constitutional issues, or this or that, trials, Pulitzer Prize-winning books. But there hadn't been a book that tried to cut horizontally through the legal issues which dominated all these things, and the guys who did it. So it was really an educational experience for me. What were these legal issues? How did these guys play it? From all the way through, from the formation of the Articles of Confederation on through. That's what prompted me to do it.
Well, I'm glad you did it. I think it's even though it's for general audiences, and that's a good thing, because it's accessible, and people can read about these issues without too much legalese in there.
Exactly.
Brian, yours is a fascinating book. We've not looked at Lincoln, and others for that matter, but certainly Lincoln, from the perspective of his skin.
Yeah.
What did it mean to be white in America, in the America that Lincoln grew up in?
Well, as we all, I think, are aware, white supremacy was the norm throughout America when Lincoln was born, and really throughout his lifetime. And this was not something that was critically questioned by the vast majority of white Americans. There were a few outliers, the radicals like William Lloyd Garrison and a few others who were radical abolitionists. But your average American took it as a given that, first of all, race did matter, that there were racial categories and that they did permeate society and that they were immutable, you couldn't change them. And second, there was the nearly universal assumption that white was on top and that everything else should be ranged somewhere underneath that, depending on who you talk to, whether it was the Irish, the Indian, the African Americans, whatever. But there was a widespread, nearly universal assumption among white Americans that white was superior, that it did matter, and that whiteness was the color of beauty, the color of intelligence, the color of what it meant to be an American was white in many people's minds, and they really weren't even separated.
Well, Lincoln was in that.
Oh, absolutely.
And in that mix. How did you think that it impacted him individually?
Oh, in a variety of ways. It was so hard to write about, because white was everywhere. Therefore, it was nowhere.
Say that that's what you were going to say, that white was almost a non-issue to most whites. They didn't think of it.
Yeah, you'd be surprised if you go back and you look. Very few white Americans in Lincoln's time are saying, here's what it means to be white. Because they're not conscious of themselves as white. They're normal. And everybody else has color. It's a slightly different way of looking at things. It made this book difficult to write because very few white Americans would step back critically and say, okay, here's what being white means and doesn't mean. You had to kind of dig the meaning out of the surroundings and kind of tease it out. For Lincoln, I believe when he is born into Kentucky society and later Indiana and Illinois, from what I can tell, and as we all know, the sources are not complete, we have to kind of infer, but for Lincoln growing up and becoming a young man, he was given the same signals that every other young white man was given, which is when you say white, you mean good, beautiful, and superior. When you say white, you mean the race that runs things, and we don't really question that. And as far as I can tell by looking at the sources, certainly the young Abraham Lincoln never questioned this, and really I'm not sure was even all that aware of his whiteness as being that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.